Thank you for returning for chapter 2 of going through the book of Jonah. And one of the things about this is I'm going to read the text and then I will comment on it. And it should be a fairly short reading this time, but chapter 2 all is one unit. It's Jonah calling out to God from the belly of the fish. So chapter 2 begins. Then Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from the belly of the fish, saying, I called to the Lord out of my distress, and he answered me. Out of the belly of Sheol I cried, and you heard my voice. You cast me into the deep, into the heart of the sea, and the floods surrounded me. All your waves and your billows passed over me. Then I said, I am driven away from your sight. How shall I look again upon your holy temple? The waters closed in over me. Deep surrounded me. Weeds were wrapped around my head. At the roots of the mountains I went down to the land whose bars closed upon me forever. Yet you brought up my life from the pit. O Lord my God, as my life was ebbing away, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer came to you in your holy temple. Those who worship vain idols forsake their true loyalty. But I, with the voice of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you. But I have vowed I will pay. Deliverance belongs to the Lord. Then the Lord spoke to the fish, and it spewed Jonah up upon the dry land. So, Jonah has come, again, he's gone the opposite direction of where God wanted him to go. God throws a storm upon the sea. The sailors do everything they can to save his life. Now, these are not Jewish sailors there, but they have done everything they can to save his life. They do everything they can to show him hospitality. And then at the final moment, they sent up an appeal to Jonah's God, not their God, saying, please don't hold us guilty of this man's life. Throw Jonah into the sea, and God provides the fish. Jonah, on the other hand, has all this time basically said, God, I would rather die than go to Nineveh. And that, I think, is one of the reasons he's told them to throw him into the sea, because if he's dead, well, he can't go to Nineveh. But God is not done with Jonah yet. Even though Jonah would rather die than have God forgive, God will not give up on Jonah. And so we have 3 days later, Jonah in the belly of the fish, crying out to God in language that is not identical to any of the Psalms, but is very familiar to anybody who's familiar with the rhythm of the Psalms. And so just a couple things about this. So again, it's the language of what I have vowed I will pay, or what I have said I will do, but the language is about going back to Jerusalem. It's about going back to the temple. It's about going back and being among God's people. And in fact, you know, the sailors in the previous chapter did everything they could to show what a person is supposed to do for a person under their care. They have embodied what the law kind of points to. But here in this psalm, Jonah takes a shot at them. You know, Jonah says, you know, worthless are those who worship vain idols forsake their true loyalty. You know, it's one of these things to where, how can anything outside of this that you've given us, the people of God, how can that be worthwhile? Another thing that Jonah never says in the midst of any of this, Jonah never repents. Jonah never says he's sorry. Jonah never asks for God's forgiveness even. What Jonah basically does is acknowledge the reality that he is distant from God, and yet there was nowhere that God was going to let him go away from him. You know, he goes down to the place where his life should have ended, and God provides a way. So all he really does is acknowledge the situation. He doesn't ever get to that point of saying, God, I was wrong. God, I need your forgiveness. Jonah never gets to that point. What Jonah is able to do is take the language that he has learned from the space of worship and lift up a prayer to God. And for God is enough. That's when God says to the fish or whale or whatever it is, now go and spit him up on the land. And so you can imagine Jonah coming out after 3 days and having to brush himself off, clean himself off, and the reality is he's still got a long way to go. Because as I mentioned last time, Nineveh is in modern-day northern Iraq along the Euphrates River. There is no sea anywhere near it. Jonah still has a long journey to get to where God has told him to go. And we haven't heard yet, but we know, if you know the story, the very next chapter, that's the first thing God is going to say. Go to Nineveh. Jonah has discovered that there's nowhere he can go. He's tried to go to the ends of the earth. There's nowhere he can go to escape from God's presence. There's nowhere where he can go where he can exit himself from God. He can't do it by ending his life. He can't do it by going to the ends of the world. And God hasn't given up on him. And I wonder if sometimes we need to hear that God doesn't give up on us. And so this concludes the second chapter. Thank you for joining me as we're doing this. We're also doing some experimenting with some different ways of doing video, so hopefully this all works out. And I look forward to next week sharing chapter 3 with you. And end.